Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel. If you're new to the channel, well firstly thanks for clicking on that link, and secondly you're going to see something a little bit different because normally I'll talk non-stop about video games, but today I thought I'd show you my video game console collection. Well, at least half of it anyway, because it's just too much for one video. So if you want to see what consoles and video game machines I've got in my collection, you just wait until after these. Now certainly the oldest machine in my collection is the Bonnetone TV Master Mark IV, and if you were a kid in the 1970s you probably had your hands on one of these things at some point, and if not exactly this machine, certainly something very similar. And in 1977 I was introduced to the world of in-home gaming, and all thanks to this remarkable little machine. And yes, it's a simple Pong clone, but when that's the only game that you really had out there, that's all you really needed. And as for recommendations as what to play if you get this, well, you've got to play them all: tennis, football, squash, because at the end of the day, one player or two player, which was another bonus feature, I think they still all stand the test of time. And paddle controllers are just chef's kiss. Mwah! Perfect for this style of gameplay. The Atari 2600, the first ever proper console I ever got my hands on. But not this particular variant, this is the Atari 2600 Junior, which was released in 1986 as a budget version to the Atari 7800. Now the first Atari 2600, and let's just drop that straight away because we didn't call it the Atari 2600, we just called it the Atari back then. But the first one that I ever played wasn't this variant, it was of course the Heavy Sixer, that wonderful 70s wood grain beast. But unfortunately I don't have one of them in the collection yet, but I'm more than happy to have this one, and we'll add a Woody as soon as possible. Now the first time I ever got to play Atari was just after Christmas 1981. It was a gift to my cousin. Now my cousin lived in the town over, so this wasn't something that I could play just any day. I had to wait until weekends, and even at that it wasn't every weekend, but those visits were enough to convince me that this was the best thing on the planet at the time. And yes, of course, the arcade ports like Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Defender, they weren't quite up to the snuff of the arcades, but when that's all that you had access to in the home, it was still such a wonderful thing. And it might not have been the first home console, it might not even have been the best home console at the time, but it was a super cool machine, and with Nolan Bushnell's business savvy and marketing expertise, it was no wonder this became a worldwide phenomenon. Ladies and gentlemen, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, and I would imagine there's a few of you out there saying, what is a ZX Spectrum? It certainly looks a lot different from most of the game consoles you see, and that's quite frankly because it was never intended to be a games console. This wonderful little machine is an 8-bit microcomputer, initially conceived by the late great Sir Clive Sinclair to bring a computer into every home in the UK in 1982. Now Sir Clive Sinclair was not the happiest of chappies when he found out this is what we were doing to his little home computer. But what did he expect people to do when we got our hands on these wonderful little machines? The first thing we did was make games for them. And yes, my little ZX Spectrum is looking a little bit worse for wear, has been through the battles, but at 40 years of age it's still working as well as it did when it rolled off that assembly line in Dundee, and people are still making new games for it. So modern games manufacturers, please sit up and take note of this fact. Next we have the Commodore Amiga range, and this is a 16-bit microcomputer. And yes, very much like the ZX Spectrum, it looks nothing like a games machine, but by the time the Commodore Amiga range came out, then gaming on home microcomputers was well established. And not only that, the 16-bit microcomputers beat the 16-bit consoles to the punch by a good 6 months, maybe even more. And the beauty of the microcomputer was it wasn't stuck to just being a games machine. You could use this for business, you could use this for educational purposes. Not that we ever did, of course. I only ever used it for Championship Manager. But that's absolutely beside the point, because of course the 16-bit microcomputers were so much more versatile. The only place they possibly fell down was in the control inputs. In other words, yes, you had a keyboard to control things with the microcomputers, you could plug in joysticks, they just hadn't got round to, well, joypads as we called them back in the day, what we now call a game controller. But on the whole, they were so much more versatile and could cope with different game genres much better than a console could, very much like the modern day PC. The Megadrive, or the Genesis if you live in North America, where they couldn't quite get the rights unfortunately due to some other pesky company having a trademark on Megadrive. And this was an absolute game changer yet again. I absolutely challenge anyone who could go back to the 1980s, have only ever experienced 8-bit gaming, to then sit down and play Sonic the Hedgehog and not having your tiny mind absolutely blown away by the phenomenal speed, the colours, the sound and just the whole general feel that the Megadrive delivered, leaving all its predecessors in the past. This for me was the first console that absolutely gave me that arcade experience in the home, and without a doubt delivered a haymaker to Nintendo, who were the undisputed champs of home gaming at the time, and it was a blow that would take them years to recover from. Sega simply nailed 90s attitude straight off the bat, with the sleek black design, the great advertising campaigns and the blast processing speed of the graphics. Now of course I have a Super Nintendo in the collection because it didn't take Nintendo too long to cotton on to the fact that Sega were giving them a right doing in the console wars. But rather than just being happy to catch up with Sega and their Mega Drive, what Nintendo managed to do was deliver something just a little bit more exciting, and that was Mode 7 graphics. A wonderful new technique that could rotate and scale background scenes and deliver some really stunning effects when used properly. But for me, this was the last time that Nintendo actually pushed forward with a new generation. And since the Super Nintendo, they've either been happy to stay just a step behind the current generation or just simply do their own thing. But without a shadow of a doubt, the Super Nintendo is one of the all-time heavyweight champions of the console wars and carries itself well in both style and substance, with a fan base that endures to this very day. Next in line in my collection we have the Sony PlayStation, the biggest game changer since the NES back in the mid 80s, and what was definitely the birth of one of the gaming powerhouses that is still here today. And even back in 1994 when this machine released in Japan, we could clearly see the blueprint that was going to make Sony one of the biggest players in the console gaming market. And not just their willingness to push ahead with modern graphics such as the new revolution in 3D polygons, but the genius stroke to make this machine not just a gaming console but also a top quality CD player, which was a coveted item back in 1994 and 1995 when the world was introduced to this machine. Later revisions of the Sony PlayStation would strip back some of the functionality that you had in the original release, but from its launch it was clear that this was going to be a very important machine that was going to be a serious contender in the console wars. And for me personally, it has a classic timeless look to it and will never look out of place in anyone's collection. Nintendo's 5th generation console, very much like Sony's PlayStation, also serves as a sort of blueprint for how Nintendo would continue with their consoles as they move forward through the generations. Now there's no denying that the N64 is a fabulous console, and its 64-bit CPU made it quite unique at the time. But what we saw here from Nintendo was a cartridge-based machine. Now it was the last cartridge-based non-handheld console for quite some time, but this fact here showed that Nintendo kinda liked to stick to what they knew. If it wasn't broken, why should they fix it? Where they did innovate, however, was in the controller ports at the front. 4 controller ports, so 4 players without having to add on an expensive multi-tap. But I suppose then we have to talk about the controller itself, which you technically have to be an octopus to use, but that's for a different video. And I think we all know by now that Nintendo haven't settled on a single design for a controller since this point, or probably will do after this point. But you've got to admit, it's really sleek, and in many ways it makes me feel like it was a console designed by the Galactic Empire. Its design certainly does seem a little bit inspired from a certain Mr. Darth Vader. So just as a little bonus part to this console collection video, I thought I'd show you the mini consoles that I have in my collection. Now I do understand and realise that a lot of people out there do not like these mini classic consoles, and usually the biggest reason is they're not original hardware and they don't run original software. For me however, this is not a problem because I see nothing wrong with emulation, because when you think about it, looking back at all the different revisions and remakes of your classic consoles, every step away from that very first console, it is well emulation, hardware and software emulation. But besides that point, there's 3 good reasons I would give anyone to pick up these mini consoles for their collection. The first one, and that's quite simple, it's the look of the things. Even if you're not going to use them for their intended purpose, which is to play games on, they make a fantastic ornamental piece that would look great in anyone's collection. Secondly, being modern consoles, they output to HDMI, which means you don't need a CRT to play these games in a proper aspect ratio, or invest in any fancy tech such as a RetroTink. You just simply plug and play into your modern TV and can play these 8-bit and 16-bit games to your heart's content. Thirdly, and probably the most important reason for me to have these consoles, is that when the modding and hacking community get their hands on them, they turn them into something so much more than what they were when you took them out the box. All of a sudden you no longer have to deal with that very restrictive and limited list of games that come on these consoles preloaded, but now you have access to thousands, nay tens of thousands of games. And we're talking games that you'll probably never be able to afford or come across in your life. And as much as I love owning a game, for me it's the experience of playing a game. And yes, people will argue that emulation's not the same as original hardware and software, but some of these games I will never get to play any other way. So without a shadow of a doubt, I can heartily recommend anyone buying one of these mini consoles, one of them at least. If you're a Nintendo fan, then go for the Nintendo consoles, the PlayStation, and as you can see from the collection I've been showing you, I've got 8-bit microcomputer minis, a PC Engine mini, so whatever it is you're looking for, there'll be one of these or more of these out there for you, and they truly are a decent little addition to any collection. So there you have it my friends, that's my video game console and video game machine collection, part 1, because obviously I didn't want to throw every machine I had into one video. It would take too long and probably bore you to tears. But if on the off chance you want to talk about any of the machines that you've seen today, then drop that down in the comments, because that's what the comments are for. And I love nothing more than interaction between you and me. It's what makes YouTube special. Thank you very much for watching as always, and until next time, cheerio!